Hello and welcome to Dr. K's Psychobabble, and today what we're going to be talking about is one of the more famous experiments in the history of psychology, and that is the experiments of Solomon Asch, who explored, among many things, topics of conformity. Now, we have to understand sort of the times that were going on in the 1940s and 1950s leading up to the time that we start to see social psychologists beginning to examine issues related to conformity and compliance and those kinds of things. And much of this comes from our experience in World War II and the Nazi regime. Now, the Nazi regime explored and it brought to light atrocities that individuals brought upon their fellow people. And questions started to arise. How could this happen? Were people just following orders based on threat, based on status? What about the group identity and its effect on individuals' behavior? What about compliance, just doing what other people are doing around you? And the fundamental question, are people evil? And individuals like Solomon Asch and other social psychologists that I'm going to feature in later videos started to ask these questions. And one of them, of course, was Solomon Asch. Solomon Asch immigrated from Poland prior to World War II. He learned English by reading Dickens. I can't imagine a better way to learn English. Quite a neat factoid in his life. He was also a Gestalt psychologist, and it's important to understand the role that Gestalt psychology, even though that particular domain is not its own field of study per se, it's the perspective, but the Gestalt philosophy really started to embed in experiments like social psychology and other areas within the field of psychology. Fundamentally, the Gestalt perspective is the sum is more than the addition of all its parts. Sorry. The product is more than a sum of its parts. Sorry about that. I got to get my quotes lined up here. That whole perspective of there's more going on here than just the little pieces has had a fundamental impact on the field of psychology and remains a very important part of the way we view the world. The behavioral point of view really looks at things fundamentally, things we can observe. The Gestalt comes along and said, well, the combination of these things, that's not it. There's other things that happen, other things that are going on because these factors are together. So Solomon Asch was interested primarily in social influence and conformity. Now it's interesting that although the timing of his study coincides with the end of World War II and the kinds of questions I looked at the beginning, his actual first inclination about the effect of other people arises from his upbringing in Poland. Sitting down for the various festivities that he had as a Jewish person, one of the events that he witnessed when he was a small child was his grandmother setting aside a glass of wine for an extra person that wasn't there. When he asked his grandmother what that was, the grandmother stated that that was a wine glass for the prophet Elijah. And when he asked his grandfather, well, will Elijah come and take a drink? And the grandfather said, yes, Elijah will come and take a drink out of that particular glass. And Solomon spent the evening staring at that glass, waiting for Elijah to come and take a drink. And she swears, and this really started that whole exploration about the effect of the situation he was in. He says that he did think he saw the level of the wine go down a little bit. And he started to think in the later years, what was going on that I perceived that? And here we are into the modern day of, well, at least in the 1950s, of Solomon Asch exploring the effect of other people's thoughts on our actual perceptual processes. Now, the experiment that he created is a very simple experiment. And what it consisted of is he advertised for students at his university to come in, and he was going to do an experiment on perception. And he gave groups of students a very simple test. He essentially had these two diagrams in front of them, and he would say to his subjects, of the lines on the right, A, B, or C, which one is the same length as the one on the left, the target? Now for you and I, this is very easy. We could see that the correct answer is C. So he would put this experiment in front of small groups of people that he had invited into the room. Now, this is not any ordinary group, however. A number of the individuals in this group were what we call Confederates. These were individuals that were in on the experiment. The only subject was one person in the room. Everybody else was in on it. So here's how he did the experiment. He would ask this group which line, A, B, or C, is the same length as the target line. And he would go around to each person and they would state their answer. The correct answer is, of course, C, but the Confederates chose B. So what would happen, Asch thought, when everybody in the room is giving the wrong answer and it comes to the subject, which way will they go? Will they tilt toward the pressure of the group? Will they stand their ground? And it's interesting to look at some original photos here. This is an example of one of those groups. We see Solomon Asch on the right-hand side explaining the experiment. And here's our subject right here. Everybody else is in on it. They ask the question. They go around. Everybody gives the wrong answer. And we get poor guy. He's sitting there going, what is going on? He's questioning his own perception. He's leaning forward. He's not aware that there's, essentially a gag going on, but he wonders what's going on. And under that pressure, people like this gentleman and others produced the data for Asch's experiment. What he found out was 23% were able to successfully withstand the social pressure, and they just went with the correct answer. 4.3% completely succumbed to pressure. Every time they did it, they went along with the group. So a small percentage going along with the group. The rest of the individuals in the study succumbed at least part of the time, and 75% of that, 75% of the subjects went with the group at least once. So what did Solomon Asch have to say about this? How could he explain this? He explained that a number of factors that he felt contributed to this particular notion. And one was avoiding ridicule if you went against the group. Some assumed they actually got it wrong, and they actually questioned their own perceptions. And of course, just fitting in with the group and not wanting to distinguish themselves as separate. Critique of this, however, has looked at some other reasons why this might have happened, and that actually shows some of the advances within psychology since Asch's time. And one of the principal explanations for this would be that the individual wanted to avoid conflict with the group. Might be strangers, whatever, didn't want to have any conflict. And there's also a question, does this really manifest in the real world? Is this really part of the explanation of the atrocities that we saw in Nazi Germany, the atrocities that we sometimes still see to this day? Now, research in conformity, going along with the group dynamics, group think, all of these things have continued through the years, and we have found some trends that we do see. There is some evidence that people are influenced by the individuals around them, but there's several factors that play in this particular dynamic. Conformity tends to increase the more people are present, when there's more people, but there's a limit to that. Once it goes beyond 4 or 5 people, the effect is not any greater. As the task becomes more difficult, conformity increases. In the face of uncertainty, as it says, people turn to others for information about how to respond. Conformity increases when other members of the group are of higher social status. When people view the others in the group as more powerful, influential, or knowledgeable themselves, they are more likely to go along with the group. Conformity tends to decrease, however, when people are able to respond privately. And research has also shown that if at least one other person in the group is going along with them, there's a lot more notion that conformity would decrease. So these are factoids about human behavior in groups that we can see in action around the world, and it helps us to identify areas where there might be error in judgment, where we ourselves might feel compelled to go along with the group, good or bad, and the different ways in which groups and our identity with those groups shape our behavior as we are actors in the world. So I hope this has been an interesting little exposure of this classic experiment, which began a long history up to the modern day on the study of the effect of groups on our behavior. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you next time.